So, Photoshop 2024. Hello everyone, welcome to My Design Class Live, the first live stream here on My Design Class. What I thought I'd do, just to start off with, is explain why we're doing live streams here on this channel. So essentially, the channel so far has been mainly a lot of short form content. And that's obviously great because I can explain things in quite a short amount of time to you about Photoshop. But a lot of the time I do get quite a lot of questions, and it can be quite hard to answer those questions without actually having the time to explain them. Or obviously if I'm writing something back as a comment, I can't actually cover everything that I want to in order to explain things. So in order to explain things a little more clearly and have the opportunity for you to actually ask me questions directly, what I thought I'd do is do some live streams here on My Design Class and also on the second channel, which is my film class. So if you're interested in that, the live stream is automatically going to redirect you at the end of this one to the other live stream on the second channel, where we're going to be looking at After Effects. And if you're unfamiliar with After Effects, it's another Adobe software where you're essentially doing graphic design, but we're adding the elements of space and time, which will make it a motion graphics project. So yeah, if you're interested in that, do feel free to join me on that after this. But yeah, great to have some of you tuning in. And yeah, feel free to ask me any questions along the way. I did, for this video, have a few questions prepared that people have sent me in the past that I thought I could go over and explain. And some of them are going to be quite common and generic questions that I've had and I've kind of grouped together in a topic. And other ones are kind of more specific questions that we'll be able to cover in this video. So without further ado, what we're going to do is jump into Photoshop and have a look at some of those things. So here we are. And the first question that I have normally is grids and guides, how to use them in Photoshop and how to actually enable them and make sure that they are appearing. So in order to do this, what we're going to need to do is first create a new project. So we're going to do that to start with. So we're going to go to File, New, and then we're going to create just a new sample document. So I always like to stay organized. So I'm going to name this one tutorial so I know what I am creating. And now we're going to try and add a guide or a grid to this document in order to help us to actually lay things out within our document. So guides, essentially we create them from the ruler in Adobe Photoshop. So as you can see, I've already got the ruler actually enabled. So I've got a top ruler here and a side ruler here. If we want to enable that, if you don't have it automatically enabled, because it doesn't actually automatically enable the first time that you open up Photoshop, what you need to do is go to Window and, View, and then go to Ruler. The shortcut for that is Command and R. I am on a Mac, so that would be Control and R if you are on a Windows device. That should enable your rulers. And in order to create guides, which are basically very handy things that we can use in a Photoshop in order to align things within our document. So anything that we then create, such as elements, such as shapes or something, will automatically snap to those guides. So in order to create a guide, it's very, very simple. All you have to do is move your mouse and actually hover over one of the rulers. You can then just hold and drag out a guide in either direction. So at the moment, I'm adding a horizontal guide, but I can also add a vertical guide by coming to this left ruler and actually dragging that one out too. Now, anything that I create, so for example, if I want to create a selection, I'll just grab the marquee tool by pressing M, or you can go up here. And it will actually snap to those guides when I try to create the box, which is very handy, obviously, because it allows us to be much more specific. One thing to note is that when we actually created the guides, you'll notice that there's a small box just appearing above our cursor on the right, and that allows us just to be a bit more specific. So at the moment it says 144.2 pixels. So I know that I placed that guide at that measurement on the y-axis. It will also snap to the edges of your canvas if you just want a nice border around your canvas, which can be quite handy if, for example, you were deciding to create a shape which actually expanded across the entirety of your canvas, something like that. When you're actually maneuvering and changing and transforming your shapes afterwards, they will automatically also snap to those guides, which is quite handy. Grids, on the other hand, are quite different. Obviously, if we wanted to create a grid system using guides like this, it would take us quite a long time, which is obviously not very efficient. If, by the way, you also want to get rid of those guides, what you need to do is just hold on one of those guides and you can just throw it away just to the side of your screen. Same for the vertical and the horizontal guides. So I can just throw all of these away. If you have a lot of them and you want to clear them quickly, just go to View, Show, Guides, and then Clear Guides. You can also lock them if you're worried about actually moving them during while you're actually making your designs. So I can just quickly clear all of my guides. Okay, so let's see how we can actually add a grid to our canvas. Now, obviously, the benefit of using grids and guides is that we can lay out our designs much more clearly. We want to have precise gaps or margins between different elements within our designs. So for example, if you're creating a page for a newsletter or something, which you'd probably generally do in InDesign, but if you did have elements that you wanted to do in Photoshop as well, having guides that actually outline the differences and the dimensions between all of your elements is very, very beneficial. So in order to create a grid, what you need to do is go to Photoshop. We're going to enable it first. So we're going to go to View, then we're going to go to Show, and we're going to go to Grid. And now, as you can see, we've added a grid to our document. In order to change the grid and actually manipulate it to the dimensions that we're looking for, what we need to do is go to Photoshop and then go to Settings. This might come up as Preferences on Windows. And then we're going to go to Guides, Grids, and Slices. So from here, we can also adjust some of the features for our guides, such as the colors and whether they're dashed, dotted, or solid lines. If, for example, blue is clashing with something in your design and you want your guides to stand out a little bit more, then you'd be able to change that here. For grids, what we can also do is adjust the color. So as you notice right now, the grid is kind of a gray color. I have a white background, so that works. But again, if you're using such as a gray background or a black background, you might want to change it so it's a white. You can also change whether they are dashed, dotted, or straight lines. So I prefer to just stick with lines like this. You can add subdivisions to your grid. So each box at the moment is 100 pixels by 100 pixels, which we've set here. You can change the dimensions if you're working in an A4 document. You might prefer to work in centimeters, and you can actually change the amount of centimeters you're using. I'm working in a pixel-based document, so I'm going to make sure I stay to pixels. And these boxes are actually a little large for me at the moment, so I'm going to just change that to 50. And as you can see, now the boxes become smaller. If you don't want any subdivisions, so subdivisions are basically these dotted lines in between our boxes, just an extra division to help us. You can just type in 0 and we'll get rid of them. Sorry, 1. There you are. If you want to add multiple divisions, so I had 3 enabled, which is the general one I try to stick to, unless I'm using dimensions that can actually need to be divided by, for example, half, quarter, then you might want to use 4 divisions, because then you've got half, quarter, 3/4, etc. in your grids. So I'm going to just stick to 3 for now, just keep it nice and basic, and then all we have to do is press OK. And just like with our guides, the benefit of this is if we create a selection, so just going back to that marquee tool, it will automatically snap to our guides. And that's just great because it allows us to be much more specific and add those proper dimensions between our elements in our design. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of grids and guides in Photoshop. One of the other questions I get quite commonly is what is the difference between vector and layer masks in Photoshop? So what I'm going to do is just quickly get rid of this grid. So we're just going to go View, and then we're going to go to Show and Grid. And that will disable our grid, just so we have a bit of a easier canvas. So in order to explain layer masks and vector masks, what I'm going to do is create a text object. So you can create a text object either by pressing T, and you'll automatically change to the type tool, or the type tool is found on the left-hand toolbar here, and you'll just be able to select it from here. So I'm just going to press once and create some text. So let's just put, I don't know, hello. Like so. I'm going to change the color, make it nice, and let it stand out clearly. And then I'm just going to tick that, and I'm going to free transform it, just Command and T or Control and T for Windows, and make it nice and large like this. So we have two types of masks in Photoshop that we can apply to our layers. So the first is layer masks, and the second is vector mask. So to create a layer mask, it's probably the most simple one. It's a rasterized based mask. So in order to do that, just make sure you have the correct layer selected and go to this mask icon at the bottom here. That will add a mask to our layer. And this basically works by using the luma differences within the layer mask to determine what is visible in our actual canvas. So at the moment, you'll notice that the entire view of the layer mask is white. Whereas if it was black, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And the benefit of this is that you can affect or crop out elements of your layer without actually damaging the layer itself by removing elements from the rasterized layer. If you have a rasterized layer, it's pixel based, which means that you can see all of the pixels. And if you try to scale a rasterized layer, it's going to be affected. Let me show you what I mean. So if I create a new layer quickly, if I create a circle, I'll just quickly do this with a selection tool just to make it stand out a bit more. I'm going to fill that layer in black. There we are. So this is a rasterized layer. It's just a regular layer. It's pixel based. So if I zoom into the layer, you can see that the circle is made up of a load of pixels. If I zoom back out, if I try to scale this circle, pressing Command and T, if I make it larger, you'll see that those pixels are stretched, which means that the circle loses its sharpness, and it becomes, the edges become much more blurred. And this is something that when we are changing our designs, we might want to change or transform the scale of our objects or our layers within our composition. And one of the best ways to maintain the sharpness is to use vectors. So if you've ever heard of the pen tool in Photoshop, which is just here, we can create a vector shape, just like this. And this information is contained within these vectors. I can scale those vectors to any size and it will remain sharp to that size, which is very, very handy. So if we go back to our layer masks and our vector masks, the hello text that we have here for the layer mask that I've created, if I want to adjust this layer mask, what I can do is either go to the paint bucket tool, or I can use the brush tool in order to affect the mask directly. So the two most important colors when you're changing a layer mask is black and white. Black will remove part of your layer. White will add to your layer mask. So any information within this layer, on top of this layer, within this mask, is going to affect the layer itself, but the original information will still be there. So for example, it's a bit confusing, so I might just show you. Make sure that you have your layer mask selected, not the layer itself, but we want a white box to appear around the layer mask. I'm going to start drawing, and as you can see, I can cut away parts of my image. As you can see within the thumbnail of the layer mask, part of it has now gone black. And that's indicating that it's removing that part of your layer. However, if I remove the layer mask, I can just hold Shift and press on the layer mask icon. That is going to disable the layer mask for a little moment. As you can see, the original layer is still unaffected. And that's the beauty of masking, because you can always go back and change the original. So if I just make sure I press Shift and reapply the layer mask, if I wanted to re-add part of my mask, what I do is switch the colors here. I just did that by pressing X on my keyboard. If you don't have white and black set as your foreground and background colors, you can just press D on your keyboard and that's going to reset those. So now that I have white selected, I'm going to re-add to my layer mask. So as you can see, I can start to paint in parts of the layer back. So this is essentially the basics of layer masks. Vector masks work slightly differently. So if I remove this layer mask just by holding and dragging it to the bin icon at the bottom, it's going to ask me if I want to delete it. I'm going to press delete. Vector masks work by using paths in Photoshop. So like I said, vectors allow us to scale to different rates and it maintains its quality. So what we can do is we can go to the pen tool and create a path. So say I wanted to mask out these two letters, the L and the double L. I'm just going to create a vector, a path around those two letters, just like so, and make sure that you complete the circle. Nothing's actually applied to our layer at the moment, so nothing should be happening, which is great. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Paths panel on the right here. And as you can see, we've created a new work path. So making sure that that work path is selected, we can now create a vector on our layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a layer mask here. And then I'm going to create another mask on top of that. And that is our vector mask. So for some reason, my shortcut wasn't working. Normally you can press Control and it should automatically apply. But as you can see now, I've applied a vector mask to this layer. So the beauty of this again is that our vector stays nice and sharp. So one of the things we need to consider when we're using a layer mask is that if we try to change the size of the content within the layer mask, it's obviously going to be, if we try to scale the layer mask itself, it's going to increase and it's going to become blurry and pixelated just like we had with the circle if we change the content directly within the mask. With the vectors, if you ever want to change the vector within the mask just by selecting the actual object, we can actually go ahead and change these points. And even if we make this mask larger or smaller, it's always going to remain sharp. And that's the benefit of using vector masks in Photoshop. So you can use either or for any of your projects. It's always better to use a mask than not use a mask. If you don't use a mask, you always run the risk of actually affecting the original layer, which is no good. If you ever want to come back and actually change it. But if you do use masks, then vector masks are going to be the most flexible in terms of actually being able to change the information within the mask to be able to adjust that later by scaling it or whatever in the future. Rather than actually rasterizing that information within a layer mask, which is rasterized. Okay, so hopefully that makes a bit of sense for vector and layer masks. So one of the other questions I had, which was quite interesting recently, actually had to do about masking effects that we might apply to our layers. So with this text object, you can obviously apply layer styles. And the easiest way to do this is just to double click on the icon itself, on the layer itself. And as you can see, you can bring up the layer style panel. From here, you can apply a load of different effects to your layer. Some of the most common ones that you might want to apply are stroke, which adds an outline to your text. Or you can apply things such as shadows, such as drop shadows. You can actually apply multiple of them in order to create drop shadow layering, which looks a bit more realistic. So there's a whole range of different effects that you can apply to your layer. So the question I had was, how do you mask only effects? So in order to actually mask effects within that we've applied to a layer, so for example, let's say I apply a stroke to this text object. I'm just going to press OK and confirm that. So normally what would happen is let me just double check that I have this setting correct. So if I normally apply a layer mask to this layer, what you'll notice is if I try to remove part of my layer using the layer mask, the effect is automatically going to adapt to the layer, to the mask effect. So for example, if I'm masking out part of this 0, of this O, you'll notice that the the stroke is automatically adapting to the new line. However, sometimes you might actually want to ensure that that's not happening, and you want to mask the effect as well as the actual original layer. So in order to do this, what you can do is just double click on the effects that come up. If you can't see this, there's just an arrow to the right of your layer, and you'll be able to expand that. Double click on this and go to the option blending options. In order to apply the mask to the effects, all we need to do is press on the tick next to layer mask height effects. And what you'll notice is now those parts of the layer are also affected. So the effects are now also masked. If we wanted, however, the question that I had was, how do you mask only the effects? So unfortunately, there's not actually a setting where you can only mask the effect and not the layer itself. The content of the layer is always going to be masked, whether you're using a layer mask or a vector mask. Both of them are going to be masked. As you can see, we can apply a mask to the effects, but applying masks to the effects themselves isn't possible. So there's a few ways we can work around this. The easiest one is what I'll show you. So essentially what we can do is, if I quickly get rid of this mask, we're going to have to create two layers for this effect. So I'm going to create a duplicate of this layer. I'm just going to hold Alt and just drag and hold and create a new copy of that original layer. Within this layer, I'm going to turn off the effects. In fact, I might even just hold and drag them off and bin them just so we're clear on what we're doing. So this is going to be a layer without any effects. The second layer, if I turn this first layer off, is the layer with the effects. You can keep the content of the layer in if you so wish. If you want to remove that, you can turn the fill of the layer to 0 and you remove the content within that layer. So all we're left with is the effect that we've applied, which in this case is the stroke. Once again, what we can do is create a layer mask on this and start to adapt. Make sure that that box is ticked, so we're actually masking the effect and not just the layer. We can select the mask, go to our brush tool, and cut out the parts of the mask that we want to remove the layer. So let's say I want to remove these 3 letters. I'm just going to be a bit rough about this. There we are. So as you can see, I've now affected the effects. In order to apply and reintroduce the original layer, I'm just going to unhide the copy of our layer. So as you can see, this is a way to mask the effects only. The downside of this is that you do have to have 2 layers, one on top of the other. You can put those in a smart object just by selecting both, right-clicking and putting it in a smart object. Or you can put it in a group if you want to keep it nice and condensed within this layer. And you want to keep them accessible within this canvas or this document specifically. So this is a way that you can essentially mask only the effects, which is quite handy if you ever need to do that. So another specific question that I get, if I just quickly delete this. When we open Photoshop up for the first time, what you'll notice is if you're zoomed out of your canvas so you can see the entire canvas, you often don't have the ability to scroll. Now at the moment I have this setting turned on so I can actually scroll up and down and left and right, no matter how zoomed in or out I am of the canvas itself. However, when you download and open Photoshop up for the first time, this feature isn't actually enabled, which can be quite frustrating if you want to be able to move around your canvas and maybe view different parts of your design at different scales. So in order to enable this, what you can do is you can go to Photoshop and then go to Settings and then go to Tools. From here, what you need to do is make sure that the overscroll option is enabled. And this is going to allow you to actually maneuver around the canvas. So if I just quickly uncheck that and show you what I meant, if I zoom into the canvas, I can actually scroll. However, if I zoom out to show the whole canvas, it's automatically going to center, which can be quite frustrating if you want to move around afterwards. So I'm just going to go back, settings, and then go to tools, and then enable overscroll. And just like that, we're now able to scroll around our canvas freely, no matter how zoomed in or out we are. Another handy shortcut, by the way, if you're very new to Photoshop, Command and plus is zoom in, Command and minus is zoom out, Command and 0 is zoom out to view your entire canvas. And those are some quite handy shortcuts that you'll use every day and will save you hours and hours if you're unfamiliar with them. So yeah, just familiarize yourself with those, because those are something that you're going to be using on a day-to-day basis and are very, very handy. So lastly, what we're going to cover, which is a question that I do get quite a lot on quite a few videos, is the difference between opacity and flow for brushes. So this is a bit more of an advanced topic, and it can be quite confusing if you're unfamiliar with it as a beginner user. But what we're going to do to demonstrate it is start off by creating a new layer. So to create a new layer, we're just going to go to the Layers panel, right to the bottom, and click on this icon. Then we're going to go to the brush tool, which is on the left-hand toolbar, or you can press the letter B on your keyboard. It's right here if you need to find it. You can change the brush settings just by going to the top here, changing the size and the hardness of your brush. You can also use several shortcuts for that. I won't go into that now, but if you are interested in that, then there should be a video on the channel, I think, about that. So then we're going to do is, there's two settings we're going to look at. So the first one is the opacity setting at the top here, and the other one is the flow setting. So there's a big difference between the two, and sometimes at the start it can look like they do similar things, and it can be a little confusing to see what they actually do. Opacity, like opacity for our layers, is specifically to do about transparency. So if I have something on my layer, for example, if I draw something, if I change the opacity of the layer, so I can just hold and drag on the word opacity, it's going to make that layer more or less transparent. 0%, we're not going to see anything. 100%, we're going to see a fully non-transparent layer. We can do the same when we actually use the brush tool. So we can actually change that setting initially. So when I'm drawing with my brush, at the moment, the opacity is 100%. So as I draw, I'm getting a non-transparent brush. It's not see-through. I can't layer anything underneath it and actually see it. If I change the opacity to, let's say, 50%, and I'm also going to change the color quickly. Let's just set it to a red. And I draw. Now you'll notice that the brush is transparent. And that's because we have the opacity set to 50%. So you can see we can see through the layer and actually see the drawing underneath. We're on the same layer at the moment. So if I change the opacity on the layer itself, it is going to affect all of the elements within the layer. So the downside of using opacity on your brush and not on your layer, so when you're drawing with a lower opacity, you can't go back and change the opacity later. This is why I'd highly encourage, if you do use the brush tool, such as maybe for highlighting or shadowing when you're editing your images, it's always best to use them on separate layers and not change the opacity as a brush within the brush tool itself. Change the opacity later using the opacity on the full layer. This will allow you just to customize it in the future. But if you do choose to use the opacity for the brush, a few things to be aware of is when you overlap on your own brush stroke, you'll notice that it doesn't add to itself. It just remains one solid color. If, however, I drew and then I drew over it, you can now see that it starts to add to those areas where I've drawn on before, making those less transparent. This is the inherent difference between opacity and flow. If I set opacity to 100% and set flow to 1%, you'll notice that I do get a transparent drawing. If I set it to 100%, you'll notice that it's just a fully non-transparent drawing. However, if I draw using a flow of 1%, The main difference with opacity is that it's acting like a pencil or a pen would in real life. Anytime you draw, it's adding to the stroke that to the brush that you've applied before. It's a little complex to explain, but if I do a curving pattern, you see when it overlaps, it automatically adds to what was already there. And this is what your pen does in real life too. Any areas where you overlap what you've already drawn, it's obviously going to add to that area and make it darker and reduce the transparency within that area. So this is kind of the benefit of using flow, which is actually quite useful, is that you can get quite a realistic look. Obviously, the overlaps aren't super realistic depending on the brush that you're using. If I reduce the hardness, you'll see that it looks a little more realistic if we were using some kind of real pencil or something in real life. Whereas here you get those kind of really sharp edges that might not be as realistic. But yeah, so flow can be quite a handy thing like this, which you can keep adding to what you've originally drawn. So that's the main difference between opacity and flow for brushes within Photoshop. And that can be very handy if you're using brushes a lot, maybe drawing illustrations and getting extra texture or more of a natural look within the things you are drawing. So those were most of the questions that I got sent in. Do feel free to send in questions for the next live stream. I will be doing another one. And do let me know in the comments if you've enjoyed this one and whether there are topics that you would like me to keep covering. Like I said, I'm going to try and do this on a regular basis, probably once a week to start off with, to see whether people like it, and hopefully we'll be able to answer quite a lot of the questions that you commonly have, and any of the be able to solve some of those things in a more visual manner rather than me just responding to your comments under other videos. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, and yeah, I'll see you in the next live stream.